Welcome, dear students, to our political science class of Standard 9th. Today, we will be doing Chapter 6, International Problems. Till the last chapter, we studied the sovereign states in the international system, India's foreign policy, and India's defense system. We also studied the objectives of the United Nations. In this chapter, we are going to study some important international problems. Now, international problems are the ones that affect many countries and eventually all the countries of the world. In this chapter, we shall study problems related to human rights, environment, questions related to refugees, and terrorism. We often hear about activists or common people fighting for their human rights. But what are these rights? And who gave us these rights? Why do people have to fight for their rights? Let's find out more about these rights. Human rights are the rights we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state. These universal rights are inherent to us all, regardless of nationality, gender, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. They range from the most fundamental, the right to life, to those that make life worth living, such as the rights to food, education, work, health, and liberty. As political upheavals of great violence, the American and French revolutions swept away many of the traditional immunities and privileges that guarded certain groups against the abuses of encroaching government. At the same time, they transformed such traditional corporate rights into human, that is, universal rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on 10th December 1948, was the first legal document to set out the fundamental human rights to be universally protected. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which turned 70 in 2018, continues to be the foundation of all international human rights law. Its 30 articles provide the principles and building blocks of current and future human rights conventions, treaties, and other legal instruments. They set forth everyday rights such as the right to life, equality before the law, freedom of expression, the rights to work, social security, and education. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, together with the two covenants, make up the International Bill of Rights, that is, the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which ensures the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights, including the rights to education, fair and just conditions of work, and an adequate standard of living. And the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which includes the right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, electoral rights, and rights to due process and a fair trial. Now, human rights are inalienable, meaning they should not be taken away, except in specific situations and according to due process. For example, the right to liberty may be restricted if a person is found guilty of a crime by a court of law. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Freedom from discrimination, set out in Article 2, is what ensures this equality. It also provides the central theme of two core instruments: the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. For example, racial discrimination in Africa, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. The concept of human rights has broadened due to several issues of global nature like contagious diseases, the threat to environment, natural disasters, etc. It also includes goals like the protection of the environment and sustainable development. All this and much more, though problems like struggle against racism, border disputes, terrorism are jeopardizing human rights on a large scale. All states have ratified at least one of the 9 core human rights treaties as well as one of the 9 optional protocols. This means that states have obligations and duties under international law to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. Human Rights Day is marked every year by celebrating the anniversary of the Universal Declaration on 10th December. The human rights in India originated long time ago. It can be easily recognized from the principles of Buddhism and Jainism. Hindu religious books and religious texts like Bhagavad Gita, Vedas, Arthashastra and Dharmashastra also contain provisions of human rights. Muslim rulers like Akbar and Jahangir were also very much appreciated for their regard for rights and justice. During the early British era, the people suffered a great violation of several rights, and this led to the birth of modern human rights jurisprudence in India. On January 24, 1947, Constituent Assembly voted to form an advisory committee on fundamental rights with Sardar Patel as the chairman. The Constitution gives the responsibility of the protection of the weaker section like women and minorities to the government alongside that of the fundamental rights. As per Human Rights Protection Act passed in 1993, the National Human Rights Commission and the State Human Rights Commission were established. The Human Rights Commission is responsible not only for taking notice of the complaints regarding violation of human rights, but also to take appropriate action against such violation. The chairman of the National Human Rights Commission of India currently, as in 2021, is Justice Shri S. Rajendra Babu. All human beings depend on the environment in which we live. A safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water and sanitation. Without a healthy environment, we are unable to fulfill our aspirations. We may not have access to even the minimum standards of human dignity. The first Earth Day was celebrated on 22nd April 1970 as the awareness and the need of saving the environment was expressed in 1970 at the international level. The experts studying the environment believed that due to industrialization on a large scale and the increasing need for energy has endangered the environment. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides used in agriculture, sound pollution due to vehicles, radiation from nuclear reactors, oil leakages, make the environment unsafe and create various problems. After the wave of globalization in 1990, the interdependence among nations increased, and therefore the need for nations to cooperate with each other emerged. Say, for example, the threat to the environment caused by pollution or by leakage of oil or gas does not remain restricted to one nation. The visible effects of the decline of the environment are extinction of species of plants and animals, decrease in the fertility of soil, water shortage, fluctuation in the proportion of rainfall, global warming, drying up of rivers and lakes, pollution of rivers and seas, incidence of newer disease, acid rain, thinning of the ozone layer, etc. Even if some of the effects are restricted to a particular nation, these problems reach global proportions. In 1972, in Stockholm, Sweden, the United Nations hosted its first conference on the human environment, the official declaration of which is commonly called the Stockholm Declaration of 1972. The Stockholm Declaration, which contained 26 principles, placed environmental issues at the forefront of international concerns and marked the start of a dialogue between the industrialized and developing countries on the link between economic growth, the pollution of the air, water and oceans, and the well-being of people around the world. The Stockholm Declaration provided a foundation for many of the environmental policies that have been established in the 113 participating countries. Additionally, the core principles presented in the declaration and the discussions that led to it sparked the creation of the United Nations Environmental Programme, which has subsequently developed more specific protocols to protect the environment. Held in June 1992 at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, the Rio Earth Summit, as it became known, was the largest environmental conference ever held, attracting over 30,000 people, including more than 100 heads of state. The objectives of the conference made towards sustainable development in order to respond to pressing global environmental problems and to agree major treaties on biodiversity, climate change, and forest management. The Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted on 11th December 1997, operationalizes the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by committing industrialized countries and economies in transition to limit and reduce greenhouse gases emissions in accordance with the agreed individual targets. The Paris Agreement was adopted by 196 parties in Paris on 12 December 2015. Its goal is to limit global warming. To achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate-neutral world by mid-century. The Paris Agreement is a landmark in the multilateral climate change process because, for the first time, a binding agreement brings all the nations into common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat nations into a common cause towards climate change and to adapt its effects. Terrorism is the calculated use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population and thereby to bring about a particular political objective. In order to attract and maintain the publicity necessary to generate widespread fear, terrorists engage in increasingly dramatic, violent and high-profile attacks. These have included hijackings, hostage takings, kidnappings, mass shootings, car bombings, and frequently suicide bombings. Although apparently random, the victims and locations of terrorist attacks often are carefully selected for their shock value. Schools, shopping centers, bus and train station, restaurants and nightclubs have been targeted because they attract large crowds. The goal of terrorism generally is to destroy the public sense of security in the places most familiar to them. The hope of the terrorist is that the sense of terror these acts engender will induce the population to pressure political leaders towards a specific political end. The deadliest terrorist strikes to date were the September 11 attacks of 2001, in which terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda hijacked four commercial airplanes, crashing two of them into the twin towers of the World Trade Center complex in New York City, and the third into the Pentagon building near Washington, D.C. The fourth plane crashed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The crashes destroyed much of the World Trade Center complex and a large portion of one side of the Pentagon and killed more than 3,000 people. Refugee crisis can refer to difficulties and dangerous situations in the reception of large groups of forcibly displaced persons. These could be either internally displaced refugees, asylum seekers, or any other huge group of migrants. Now, generally, these people have been denied a nationality and access to basic rights such as education, healthcare, employment, and freedom of movement. The partition of the British Raj provinces of Punjab and Bengal and the subsequent independence of Pakistan and one day later of India in 1947 resulted in the largest human movement in history. Approximately 1 million Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs died during this event. From 1933 to 1941, Nazi Germany pursued an aggressive policy of forced emigration for the Jews. More than 340,000 Jews emigrated from Germany and Austria. Of these, about 1 lakh who fled to other European countries subsequently were killed in the Holocaust. The world is currently dealing with the largest refugee problem on record, with more than 25 million people uprooted from their homes and living abroad in host communities. Of this 25 million, 11 million according to UNICEF are children. This number has doubled over the last 10 years. While there are risks and challenges for all refugees, living an uprooted life has unique impact on children. Here are 5 of them. Limited access to quality education, compromised mental health and the threat of lost childhoods, separation from families and greater vulnerability, shifting family dynamics and responsibilities, isolation in host community. On December 4, 2000, the United Nations declared December 18 as International Migrants Day. The United Nations did so to recognize the increasing number of migrants around the world and to reaffirm member nations' commitments to migrants' freedom and human rights. Nearly 2 decades later, compounding issues around the world have led to over 65 million people displaced abroad or within their own borders, the most ever recorded by the United Nations Commissions on Human Rights. After almost 7 years of civil war, half of Syria's population has been displaced, creating over 6 million refugees, about a third of the world's total refugee population. Syrian refugees have fled the country to neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. In 1951, some provisions were made regarding the question of refugees at the international level. One such provision was that the refugees will not be forcefully sent back to their country against their wishes. Similarly, an office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations has been established on December 14, 1950 to solve their problems. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights has been working ever since to help refugees. In a world where nearly one person is forcibly displaced every 2 seconds as a result of the conflict or persecution, the work of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights is more important than ever before. Refugees are being forced into taking increasingly expensive and dangerous routes to reach their countries of destination, and many are dying on the route. For refugees who survive these dangerous journeys, conditions of reception in countries of destination are also often inadequate. Recent reports have highlighted the insalubrious and dangerous conditions for refugees living in hotspots on the Greek islands, for example. Many refugees now find themselves trapped in dirty and overcrowded camps. It is clear that the number of refugees will not diminish significantly in the near future. So, we must be concerned with answering these questions and to provide recommendations and solutions that will ensure better protection for those impacted by displacement and reduce the insecurities and violence faced by refugees across the world. If all the nations safeguarded and fostered human rights, exploitation and violence will reduce. All people will be able to achieve their own development safely and securely. Human rights can be more effectively implemented if the environment is safeguarded and if terrorism is completely wiped out. No group of people will have to become refugees. For this, all nations will have to come together, cooperate with each other, take concrete action, and bring about actual change. Next year, my dear students, we shall study how India has progressed in this direction. That's all for now. Thank you.